Welcome, everybody. Thanks for coming to our Wabanaki Voices series. Coming in person, it's great to have people here. I'm here to introduce Osihkiyol. Crofton-Macdonald is a Wolastoqey person from the Houlton Band of Maliseets Indians and the Oromocto First Nation in New Brunswick, Canada. Zeke has spent his life advocating for Native rights in the United States and Canada. He's currently serving as a tribal ambassador for the Houlton Band of Maliseets in Maine. He serves as a secretary on the board of directors for the Wabanaki Alliance and as a tribal co-commissioner for the Houlton Band on the Maine Indian Tribal State Commission. Zeke graduated from the University of Maine in 2015, where he received degrees in history and political science, and is attending graduate school at the University of New Brunswick, where he studies history. He's working on a master's thesis on Wabanaki Treaty History. Before assuming his duties as ambassador, Zeke worked for the Welamukotuk First Nation in Resource Development Consultation with the Wolastoqey Nation New Brunswick as a co-researcher, documenting treaty hunting and harvesting rights in the province, as a research associate at the Atlantic Canada Studies Center at the University of New Brunswick, and worked for the Houlton Band of Maliseets with the Indian Child Welfare Act. So let's all welcome Zeke.
Okay, hey everyone. Thank you for coming. I just have a speech here, a presentation. Unfortunately, I didn't have any visuals, so hopefully just listening to me will be enough. Kwe, Niliwis, Ezekiel Crofton-Macdonald, Wolastoqey Ignale, Nujayal Welamukotuk Naga Wolamukotuk. Hello everyone, my name is Zeke Crofton-Macdonald. I'm a Wolastoqey or Maliseet person from the Houlton Band of Maliseet Indians in Maine and Oromocto First Nation in New Brunswick, Canada. I currently serve as my nation's tribal ambassador at the Houlton Band of Maliseet Indians. To share a little bit more about myself, I attended the University of Maine, Orono for my undergrad, and attended the University of New Brunswick at Fredericton for graduate school. I'll be graduating this coming fall with a master's degree in history and defending my thesis entitled The Watertown Treaty of 1776 and the History of Unceded Wolastoqey Territory in Aroostook County, Maine. Alongside my graduate studies, I also worked for the Welamukotuk First Nation in New Brunswick as assistant to the Resource Development Consultation Coordinator. And I'll explain that a little bit more later in my presentation. And before returning to school, I worked for my home community, the Houlton Band of Maliseets, working for the Indian Child Welfare Act. I was invited to present today and lead a pretty open-ended conversation about my work and research. I hope to leave plenty of time at the end of this presentation open for questions and discussion. I've spent the last few years as a grad student in history, so the lecture format feels comfortable to me, but I know a more personal discussion would probably be preferable to many. My presentation today will be on tribal sovereignty and some of the recent efforts on behalf of the Wabanaki nations in Maine to modernize the Maine Indian Land Claim Settlement Act and our recent legislative efforts in the State House. As a treaty historian as well, I'd like to provide some history. I think the only way we can truly understand the need for change in issues of tribal governance today is to understand the history of this land. We have had a long and complicated history with this state, and it is a difficult thing for anyone to navigate. I spent my young life so far attempting to navigate this history and these politics for my own people, and I'd like to, in turn, share some of what I've learned. I've explained some of my colonially educated background, but much of my knowledge, if not the bulk of my knowledge, has come from within our Wabanaki communities. I think that it's important that before I launch into this presentation, I should situate myself in place and family. I was born here in the United States, but have family on both sides of the border with New Brunswick. Some of my family live here in the Houlton Band of Maliseet Indians, or in our language, Wolastoqey, which translates as by the Wolastoqey River. But many of my cousins live throughout the First Nation reserves just across the border in Welamukotuk or Oromocto First Nation, Zedantzisk or St. Mary's First Nation, and Nugukuk or Tobic First Nation. I was living and working in Welamukotuk for the past 5 or so years and recently moved back to Houlton. I also think it is worth explaining a bit of geography and language. There are 5 Wabanaki nations today, though only 4 have representation in the state of Maine. These are the Wolastoqey, the Passamaquoddy, the Penobscot, and the Mi'kmaq. The 5th historic member are the Abenaki. They have tribal communities in Vermont and New Hampshire, and across the border in Canada, and ancestral territory in the southern parts of Maine, but no federally recognized land in Maine. Federal recognition is not the basis for who is a Wabanaki person, though. Abenaki people live throughout Maine to this day, regardless of whether or not the federal or state governments choose to recognize that. I began this presentation by introducing myself in my traditional language, Wolastoqey Latue Wagan. The ability to introduce myself is part of the very limited language I carry. As a people, we are actively working to reclaim a lot of the language that we lost and language that was forcibly taken from us. Part of that reclamation process is the effort to reclaim our traditional name. For many of you, the word Wolastoqey is probably brand new. There's another way of saying Maliseet. The word Maliseet is not the way we traditionally refer to ourselves. It is actually a Mi'kmaq word, meaning he or she is progressing slowly. It is not a particularly kind word at all, actually. There is some interesting history behind the use of that word and how it entered our identity. From my understanding, it was first adopted by the French, who encountered the Mi'kmaq and must have asked them who we were. Whichever Mi'kmaq person they spoke to called us Maliseet. Perhaps they had a good laugh about that, but the word stuck. It entered the colonial consciousness through documentation, letters, and maps, and eventually treaties. But that was not a word we used to refer to ourselves. Our traditional name is Wolastoqey. Wolastoqey means the people of the Good River. It's a reference to our homeland along the Wolastoq River, or in English, the St. John River. And as a side note here, that word Wolastoq is also the origin of the name Aroostook County, by the way. If you were to Google the name Aroostook, it would explain that the county got its name from the Aroostook River. If you were to trace the name of the Aroostook River, you'd find that it was named after a Jesuit settlement in the 1600s, which sat at the cross-section of 2 rivers. One of those rivers is what we now know as the Aroostook. The other river it rested beside was the Wolastoq. That Jesuit settlement was named after Wolastoq, and by a fun quirk of historical fate, the name of the settlement became the name of the other river, and the name of that river became the name of the county today. So in short, Aroostook County would be much more aptly named Wolastoq County. And I encourage you all to adopt that language, by the way, that would be awesome. And in fact, the entire county is traditional Wolastoqey territory. Our territory recognized by the other Wabanaki nations and the Europeans too, when they first began signing treaties and drawing up maps, was the Wolastoq River watershed, extending from Quebec through northern Maine, eastern New Brunswick, and out to the Atlantic Ocean. The Wolastoqey people, citizens of the Wolastoqey Nation, live throughout this territory to this day. That is the first myth I'd like to dispel in this presentation. Our people have never relinquished our territory, and we never intentionally alienated any of it. To this day, we have citizens living and claiming the land in Quebec, people throughout all of Aroostook County, and large populations in New Brunswick. This is all Wolastoqey territory, and to this day, it remains unceded and unsurrendered. I mentioned that we have had our language forcibly taken from us. And I think it is worth explaining that a bit more. My elders teach that the Wabanaki nations and my Wolastoqey Nation have existed on this land since time immemorial. Recent science and archaeology point to at the very least 10,000 years on this land, but our oral histories go back far longer. Our stories tell that we have always lived on this land. The Mi'kmaq, for instance, have stories dating back to the recession of the last ice age. For most of that history, our nations occupied and controlled this territory, and our languages rang throughout the land. Part of the effort on the part of the European settlers to erase our presence from this land over the course of just the last 300 or so years was to erase our languages. In our schools here in Maine, we teach the very bare bones of this story. For the most part, colonization is portrayed as something that happened long ago, and mostly in places very far away. We teach of Christopher Columbus, or perhaps the Trail of Tears, or Manifest Destiny. If there is discussion or any kind of knowledge about the residential school systems, for instance, it is thought that they happened out west, in places like Oklahoma or the Dakotas. But this is the history of this land as well. My grandmother was forcibly taken from her home when she was 6 years old and placed in a residential school in Wabanaki, Nova Scotia. This is not ancient history. It is not the history of a far-off place. She was born on the St. Mary's Reserve along the banks of the Wolastoqey River in New Brunswick, the same river that extends through much of Aroostook County, Maine. The Canadian government, alongside the RCMP and the Christian churches, took her from her family when she was a child because they believed that she would grow up to be a more productive member of colonial society if she was raised away from the influences of her parents. She didn't leave that school until she was in her late teens. When she was finally able to leave the school at age 16, she ran. She ran to the United States, thinking things would be better here. But here in the US, she encountered the foster care system, perhaps a more modern way of achieving that same goal. To this day, I have cousins spread across the country, taken from her family, raised in white households and the foster care system, raised without knowledge of their culture, their language, their land. This is my family history right now. It is not part of some ancient past. Thanks to the internet, the youth of my family have been working on reconnecting and rebuilding, and we're finally just now having the opportunity to meet each other. This is what I mean when I say it was taken from us. I did not have the chance to learn my language because my grandma refused to speak it. She carried those scars of fear her entire life. My family story is not unique. It is the same story throughout Indian country. Today, the Penobscot and Passamaquoddy nations have access to a piece of federal legislation called the Indian Child Welfare Act, or ICWA. ICWA was designed to give tribal nations the jurisdictional authority to keep their own children within their communities. Even if a child enters a foster care system, ICWA allows the tribal nation the opportunity to find that child a home here in our communities first. It's a powerful law that has done amazing work over the past few decades. Unfortunately, though, the Houlton Band of Maliseets and the Mi'kmaq Nation in Presque Isle do not have full access to ICWA on the same level as the other Wabanaki nations. We do not have the same power to protect our children. This is because of the specific wording of the 1980 Maine Indian Land Claims Settlement Act. Changing this wording and allowing us to protect our children is one of the biggest priorities for the Houlton Band today. Right now, the Indian Child Welfare Act is under attack in the US Supreme Court. In the Brackeen v. Holland case, Texas lawmakers have argued that ICWA is a race-based law and therefore unconstitutional. Our right to protect our children is not on account of our race. It is because we are nations, recognized as such by the US Supreme Court and federal law. It is not a racial issue, it is a political and international one. Despite the treaties we have signed establishing our sovereignty, the right to protect our children is one of the few ways we can still practice that sovereign nationhood. The 1980 Maine Indian Land Claims Settlement Act will be a main focus of my presentation today. If you went to high school here in Maine, you're probably aware that this act exists, but don't understand much about it. Even if you grew up in our native communities, there's a solid chance you didn't learn about this. It is not something that is discussed very much. I have a few of my own theories of why that might be. And I think if I do my job right, I hope my presentation will provide you all with the information you need to form your own opinion. But today, I'll try to explain some of the basics of the Settlement Act and spread some awareness. As I'm sure many of you are aware, if you chose to join us today, the Wabanaki nations have been working alongside the Maine State Legislature for the past few years to assert our tribal sovereignty and our self-determination. Many of the limitations we face today in the practice of our sovereign nationhood are an account of the 1980 Settlement Act. I'm actually very excited to talk to college students about this. And as I understand it, we have some Native students with us, and I'm very grateful for that. I spent a lot of time attempting to navigate these topics with older people who are pretty set in their ways. But for myself and probably many of you, we weren't even born yet in 1980. I think we should be free to re-examine our own history today with fresh eyes, and hopefully less prejudiced eyes. One of the biggest questions that popped up back in 1980 when my elders were negotiating the Maine Indian Land Claims Settlement was the question, how can a nation exist inside another nation? That is actually a recurring question that has popped up again just this past legislative session when we were advocating what was called the Tribal Sovereignty Bill. The question, how can the tribes be sovereign when they are inside the United States? So I'd like to begin with this. The reason why a nation-to-nation relationship is necessary is predicated in history. It is the intended way our relationship was meant to function. Justice demands that we honor this. Our Wabanaki nations have lived and governed this land for over 10,000 years. I know that is a massive number and one that many of you probably already knew, but I want us all to sit and consider that for a moment. That there was a civilization on this land, that there were governments and laws on this land that had managed to enforce a balance for over 10,000 years. In contrast, the United States has existed for about 250. And this is not just history. Our nations are still here. Our national governments are still sovereign and still working to care for our people the way we have always done. That idea that we never relinquished our sovereignty, that our tribal nations never ceased practicing our nationhood, is probably a very strange concept for many Americans. Again, it's that question, how can a nation exist within another nation? The answer lies in indigenous epistemologies and worldview. It lies in expanding your definition of law and sovereignty from just the Eurocentric understanding. To give an example of this, because I consider myself a historian, I'd like to give an example from history. When I was a kid, I learned about treaties from my elders in the community. In Houlton, I learned of the Watertown Treaty of 1776. In New Brunswick, I learned of the Peace and Friendship Treaty signed between the Wabanaki and the British Crown starting in 1725. As a kid, I learned that these treaties were expressions of our sovereign nationhood. I learned to be proud of this history. I was excited to go to school, learn more about treaties, and return home and use these treaties to right injustice and reunite the Wolastoqey Nation. That idea of reuniting the nation was a big dream growing up, by the way. But when I got to school and finally read these documents in full, I was disappointed. I wanted to see us claim land and rights and assert our nationhood. Neither the Mascarenes Treaty of 1725, the first of the Peace and Friendship Treaties, nor the Watertown Treaty of 1776, the first Wolastoqey American Treaty, established a clear claim over land. They didn't discuss boundaries of claim in the way I had been trained to understand nationhood. But that is the key. I had been trained to see Eurocentric ideas of sovereignty and nationhood. We all have been. In European history, a claim to nationhood is a claim over land. The two are inseparable. But from with our Wabanaki worldview, land is not something that can be owned or claimed in that way. Instead, what these treaties did was establish a relationship between nations to live and use the land alongside each other as sovereign nations and allies. That was the origin of the relationship formed between the Wabanaki nations and the United States and Canada. In New Brunswick today, they teach that this relationship embodied in these treaties still exists today, as it must. The Peace and Friendship Treaties did not cede land, but only established a relationship, a nation-to-nation relationship. We approach the formation of this relationship from within our own understanding of law and sovereignty. These conceptualizations of sovereignty had developed over centuries and have just as complex a history as any similar notion in European history. If we are to examine treaty documents from within a mindset of equality today, then we need to devote equal time to understanding each culture's conceptualizations of law, sovereignty, and governance. And importantly, if we are to attempt to settle any of these agreements, the resulting effort must centralize the intentions of the original signers of the agreement. That means equal effort needs to be devoted to understanding how Wabanaki people understood concepts of international diplomacy. There is a myth in colonially sourced histories that our Wabanaki nations did not create laws, and we did not engage in things like international diplomacy before the Europeans came and brought their own ideas. That is, of course, flawed and frankly ridiculous from a Wabanaki perspective. The Wabanaki Confederacy itself is an entity of international law. Historically, the Confederacy was held together by what is known in our language as the Kachilakotawagin, which roughly translates as the Great Treaty. The Confederacy itself was a treaty relationship. The way we practice law and sovereignty looked fundamentally different than the definitions of these words that we understand today and what Europeans understood in the colonial era. Today, there are whole subsections in the study of law devoted to understanding indigenous legal concepts. Many of these indigenous concepts can shed a brighter light on the future and can help us all navigate a changing world and our population's changing needs. These are teachings that can help us chart a new future together. In my Wolastoqey teachings, a treaty is not just a document, it is a relationship. And it does not just outline territorial, political, or jurisdictional concerns. This relationship is meant to help foster and govern all aspects of interpersonal and interenvironmental life. These treaties were living and breathing and never set in stone. Such is the nature of any meaningful relationship. Any modern-day attempts to settle these agreements must carry the same intention. Unfortunately, though, over the last few centuries, these treaties have almost exclusively been interpreted from within a very narrow and Eurocentric view. This view is focused almost entirely on transfer of exclusive political jurisdiction and title claim to property. This is not why we sign treaties. If we are to achieve justice today, our first step needs to be in treating each perspective with the same importance. I think my explanation of tribal sovereignty should begin here, to help us all navigate this divide between our different worldviews. It is the only way to have this discussion in a truly equal way. To start, I think it is worth pointing out that the very word sovereignty derives from Eurocentric epistemologies or ways of knowing. Embedded within the word sovereignty is the word sovereign. In European history, this has had a specific meaning. It refers to forms of monarchy and a central sovereign individual in which ultimate power is vested. Throughout European history, whether that ultimate authority is vested in a king or in God or in the representatives of God, has been an issue of utmost concern. Our Wabanaki nations do not have this history. The definition of sovereignty to us looks entirely different. In my traditional Wolastoqey worldview, we have concepts like body sovereignty. This is the idea that you have the ultimate say in what happens to your own body. Likewise, we have concepts like food and water sovereignty. And here comes a strange one, at least to many Americans. Water sovereignty also means that water is sovereign. Trees and land and squirrels are sovereign as well. Each of these relatives should have a say in what happens to their bodies. This is a fundamentally different way of looking at the world. The land, the water, the animals are not resources, they are relatives. This is the worldview from which we signed our treaties. We are not claiming exclusive jurisdictional power or exclusive right to territory when we met the European newcomers. We operated from within our understanding of law and sovereignty. That means that we would not have attempted to stop another people from asserting their own nationhood and their own right to live. This right to exist and care for your own body is embedded within our very worldview. This is an aspect of these treaties that can still inform our relationship today. Tribal sovereignty does not just mean political jurisdictional authority. It can also mean things like food and water sovereignty, the ability to care for our own lands, waters, and people as sovereign nations. So when the Wabanaki nations in Maine today say that we have never relinquished our sovereignty, we're not just talking about land. We are talking about the responsibility to care for our citizens, a responsibility we have never relinquished and a priority that will never change. I hope that brief overview of what sovereignty means to us was helpful in framing this discussion. So when you hear a Wabanaki person in Maine say that we are advocating for the recognition of our sovereignty as opposed to the creation of sovereignty, I hope you understand better what that means. And to give a specific example of what this relationship could potentially look like today, I'd like to share a story from my time working in Canada. While I was in graduate school and studying for my master's, I worked in one of my home communities at Welamukotuk First Nation as the assistant to the Resource Development Consultation coordinator. I say one of my home communities because I have family on both sides of the border. Many Wolastoqey and Wabanaki people in general are like this. Our family groups do not just follow the lines that have been imposed on us by either the United States or the Canadian government. This is part of the reason why it is appropriate to say that we have always practiced our sovereignty and have never stopped. We have always maintained our connection with all of our territory. These past few years during COVID demonstrated that to me again and again. Throughout our Wabanaki communities, I kept hearing how the border closures stopped people from visiting their kids or their spouse or their family. The United States and Canada might have attempted to impose this separation on us, but we have refused to ever lose contact with our relatives on the other side of that border. But to give a little backstory on my role in Welamukotuk, I worked in Resource Development Consultation. For those of you who might not be familiar, consultation refers to the legal responsibility of a government to consult with indigenous nations when they're considering any kind of new legislation or to approve private changes which might affect our traditional or ancestral territory. This type of law is not just practiced in Canada. It is an aspect of the US federal Indian policy as well. Here in Maine, however, we do not have access to this type of law, in part because of the wording of the Settlement Act. Federal Indian consultation policy, which applies to other Native nations across the country, does not apply to us. In fact, no federal Indian policy post-1980 applies to us at all, unless the state specifically votes to allow that application. In Canada, the Canadian federal government has the duty to consult. This means that any proposed resource development project conducted by either federal, provincial, or private proponents must consult with the Native nations whose treaty territory they are in. This has done a tremendous amount of good. Our nations work alongside environmental groups and work to make sure that any project that enters our territory is held to a high standard. That standard centralizes the need to maintain the health of the land and waters. Our people live and use the land to a much greater extent than most other citizens in the province, and we are directly affected by unsafe changes to the environment. We eat the fish and hunt the game every year. Maintaining the health of those resources is a top priority for First Nation governments, which have historically been impacted by things like cancer at a much higher rate than the rest of the province. This is also the case in our tribal nations in Maine, by the way. Cancer and birth defects plague our communities, and much of it has to do with the unhealthiness of the environment. My job was to help handle the correspondence between the Canadian government and the Welamukotuk First Nation government. In New Brunswick, the federal government recognizes that the entire province is the treaty territory of the Wolastoqey nations, which, by the way, is language we should also be using here in Maine as well. But the reason why we don't use that language has to do with the specific wording of the Settlement Act, which claims that all state responsibility to recognize any treaties or rights deriving from treaties was absolved in 1980. Part of my job was to work with the other Wolastoqey First Nation governments and the other Wabanaki nations in the province. In the course of my job, I had multiple files that would have directly affected my home community in Houlton. I was living in New Brunswick, but most of my family was still in Maine, and I wanted to be able to protect the lands and waters of my home in Maine as well. Water runoff from chemical spraying, the flow of streams and water and rivers, and the migration of animals does not stop at the international border. Well, the Houlton Band does not, in fact, have the authority to do much at all in the protection of their lands and waters that necessarily affect our citizens. Again, this is because of the wording of the Settlement Act. Even the lands that we do not have full control over because they are defined as trust lands under the Act. I explain this because I think it is a good place to start when we talk about the changes we can start to implement here in the state. We do not have to reinvent the wheel. The government of Canada has already gone to much greater lengths in their efforts to amend their historical relationship with Native peoples. The US federal government has as well. There have been many heavily debated and negotiated cases dealing with Native people in the US since 1980. We should take inspiration from this and improve our relationship here in Maine as well. And I think it is worth noting that this is not just something that the US and Canada are facing. These are changes that are happening all over the world. In 2007, the United Nations passed the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, or UNDRIP. UNDRIP outlined a very clear policy and resource development projects within the territory of Indigenous peoples and goes much further than either the United States or Canada. In UNDRIP, they did not just establish a duty to consult, they established a duty for free, prior, and informed consent from Indigenous people before allowing a proponent to harvest resources within a territory. Some of you might already be familiar with UNDRIP. The state of Maine passed a resolution in support of UNDRIP in 2008. But again, because of the wording of the Settlement Act and the fact that the state of Maine has considered its responsibility to recognize Indigenous territorial interests settled in 1980, most of it doesn't apply. It's really just an empty gesture without much meaning. In New Brunswick today, the Wolastoqey Nation celebrates an annual Treaty Day. The tribal chiefs and representatives from the Canadian government gather on the banks of the Wolastoq River, or in English, the St. John River, and symbolically sign a treaty and renew the peace and friendship treaty relationship. It is thought that this treaty relationship between the two peoples never ended. They teach that the peace and friendship treaties from 1725 to 1778 did not cede land, but only established a relationship of peace and friendship between sovereign nations and allies. Over the course of recent history, following landmark court cases in the Canadian Supreme Court, such as R.V. Marshall in 1999, historians and legal scholars have worked to reinterpret these treaties to include an understanding of Wabanaki worldview. This is the basis for the treaty-obligated hunting and harvesting rights for Wolastoqey and Mi'kmaq people in the province today. This is history that should necessarily impact us here in Maine as well. The United States benefited from these same treaties, but we have not been working to reinterpret and include Wabanaki worldview within our modern-day relationships. In fact, the state of Maine teaches that all obligations to foster any treaty relationship was absolved in 1980, the Settlement Act. According to the wording of the Maine Indian Land Claim Settlement Act, quote, "This act constitutes a general discharge and release of obligations of the state arising from any treaty or agreement with any Indians of the state," end quote. Representatives of the state, as recently as last year, have interpreted this to mean that the state does not have any obligation to recognize Wabanaki nationhood. This is not what this clause says. Our Wabanaki nationhood is not defined by our inclusion within a treaty with either the United States or Maine, any more than the United States' nationhood is defined by their international agreements. That international recognition is helpful, but ultimately, sovereignty is something that you practice. It is not something that is given. The United States government and the US Supreme Court has interpreted federal Indian policy in a completely different way than the state of Maine. I can't claim that they have entirely eliminated harmful forms of colonialism in their mindset. For that matter, neither has Canada, but they have taken significantly more steps towards that goal than Maine has. And as an example, the following was taken from an explanation issued by the state government of Oregon. Quote, "A tribal government derives its sovereign power from the people and from its connection to ancestral territory. Tribal sovereignty is not a gift bestowed by an external government and is not outlined in the US Constitution, although the sovereign status of tribes is recognized by the US government and has been upheld by the US Supreme Court. Sovereign nations have the right to form their own government, determine membership or citizenship, make and enforce laws, regulate trade within borders, and form alliances with other nations. Sovereignty is the internationally recognized right of a nation to govern itself, and American Indian tribes existed as sovereign governments long before Europeans settled in the Americas," end quote. This explanation is very, very different than the way tribal governance is talked about in the state of Maine. Here in Maine, it is taught that the Settlement Act settled the state's obligation to form a nation-to-nation relationship with any of the Wabanaki nations. That is not the way we have interpreted this agreement. Our sovereignty and nationhood was never on the table. Part of the divide here is due to our very different perspectives on sovereignty, nationhood, and land. The state's historic perspective concerning this act is premised on the assumption that the only thing the state is required to recognize regarding the Native nations within its borders are the treaties between the nations and the state, which specifically outline claim to land. Any other agreements or proof of sovereign control and occupation of territory is not valid unless there is a treaty specifically outlining territorial claim. This is, of course, problematic, as our people did not establish claim to territory through treaties. We established it through the act of occupying and controlling our own land. We established it through hunting, fishing, and harvesting on our land, and we have never relinquished our right to do this. I'm tempted to go on a long explanation here of the historical proof of this occupation and control of territory, though I don't want to derail the conversation from the ways we can amend this relationship today. So I'll just share one example. The Watertown Treaty of 1776. As the ambassador for the Houlton Band of Maliseets, I want to center an example from the Wolastoqey Nation's history. But in this particular instance, the Watertown Treaty is an excellent example for all of Wabanaki. The Watertown Treaty was negotiated and signed between representatives from the Massachusetts Bay on behalf of the Second Continental Congress and representatives of the Wolastoqey and Mi'kmaq nations. It should be noted that although Penobscot and Passamaquoddy were not party to this treaty, they signed their own agreement with the United States and formed similar alliances in the Revolution. For the Revolutionary War buffs in the crowd, following the outbreak of the Revolution and the Declaration of Independence, the town of Watertown served as the center of what some called the, quote, government in exile for the revolutionaries in Massachusetts. They worked alongside the Second Continental Congress and crafted the United States' first ever international treaty. This was the Watertown Treaty, and it was signed on July 19th, 1776, only 2 weeks after the signing of the Declaration of Independence. This treaty was a treaty of, quote, alliance and friendship. It did not deal with land in any way. The Wolastoqey and Mi'kmaq nations agreed to fight alongside the fledgling American state, and the Massachusetts representatives agreed to conduct meaningful and prolonged trade out of a truck house in Machias. George Washington was a major force behind the formation of this alliance. He drafted the letter which first asked for this support from the Wabanaki nations. The reason why George Washington and the Continental Congress were interested in forming this alliance was because they knew the Wabanaki nations held the balance of power in the region. The second the British colonial government in Nova Scotia got wind that the Wabanaki nations had created a treaty with the Americans, they went into a panic. They knew that if they wanted, the Wabanaki nations could overrun their tiny British settlements and bring revolution to their doorstep. In fact, in towns like Majorville, in present-day New Brunswick, the British settlers quickly pledged their support for the American cause out of fear of this exact scenario. The Nova Scotia colonial government asked for an increasing number of British troops to defend their province against the possibility of attack from the Wabanaki nations, lessening the number of troops they could deploy against the Continental Army in places like New York. We often forget about this history in our remembrance of the American Revolution, but it is well documented in the history of Great Britain and Nova Scotia. The reason why this treaty sparked such fear in the Nova Scotia colonists was because they knew exactly how strong the Wabanaki nations were, and they were terrified of starting another war. They worked hard in the years following this treaty to renegotiate terms of peace with the Mi'kmaq and Wolastoqey. The eventual peace treaty did not cede territory, but recognized each nation's sovereign nationhood and renewed the peace and friendship relationship. By the close of the Revolution, the Wolastoqey Nation had created relationships with both the United States and Great Britain and demonstrated their intention to remain a sovereign and independent state between the two. If we are looking for evidence of occupation and control of this territory at the turn of the century, we should not need to look further. But this reality is continually evidenced throughout Maine history. Again, I am tempted to give more examples in Maine history, but I'll leave it at that. The United States and Great Britain knew that the Wabanaki nations were in control of this territory. They knew they were sovereign and could sign any international agreement that they wanted. I think it is important to center our discussion on this particular time period because the eventual Maine Indian land claim settlement, the elephant in the room we still need to address, was premised on settling the land dispute resulting from a treaty at this time, the Treaty of 1794. If we are to attempt to understand the original intention behind the creation of this treaty, and thereby settle the treaty or craft something new which embodies the original intention of this treaty, then we must understand the historical context in which that treaty was signed. In 1794, the United States did not have claim to the land of the Wabanaki nations. The Treaty of 1794 did not give them land claim or title to this land. It was not bestowed to them by the British government. The British did not have claim to this territory either. All they had was a treaty of peace and friendship. Instead, the 1794 treaty outlined a territory that the Wabanaki nations would refuse to allow American settlement. I phrase this with intention. The Wabanaki nations were sovereign and had the ability to sign any international agreement that they wanted and had the ability to refuse encroachment into that territory. Many modern-day discussions of this treaty use phrases like reserved Indian territory. This language is historically inaccurate. Evidence that, like the earlier Watertown Treaty, demonstrates that this land was in the control of the Wabanaki nations and under our jurisdiction. Reserved Indian territory implies that the United States had exclusive jurisdiction over our land and had the power to create reservations. They did not. This is why we can say today that the Wabanaki nations have never relinquished their right to inherent sovereignty and nationhood. This did not happen in 1794, and it did not happen in the Maine Indian land claim of 1980. Here is a helpful excerpt from Wabanaki Legal News, published in 1998. Quote, "The Settlement Acts, in general, did not create the powers currently exercised by the nation. The Settlement Acts help to delimit and define those powers, but are not their source. In fact, the Settlement Acts actually diminished the nation's powers by transferring certain authorities to the state of Maine. Remember that the current sovereign powers of the nation reflect its inherent sovereignty, which has never been expressly ceded by the tribe nor extinguished by explicit federal action. This idea is the starting point for any analysis of tribal authority, and its importance cannot be overly stressed." End quote. The state of Maine's stance on the Settlement Act, in many ways, still indicates a colonial mindset that refuses to fully embrace a full understanding of the history of the treaty. They argue that the Wabanaki nations within their borders are tribes, not nations. In 1980, during the negotiations leading up to the Settlement Act, the state repeatedly shared their fear that they needed to avoid passing legislation which created a, quote, nation within a nation. But this is what tribal sovereignty is, and exactly what history and justice would demand. The definition of tribal sovereignty adopted by the US Supreme Court accepts and attempts to understand this point. They have adopted phrases like domestic dependent nations. But the state of Maine, thanks to the wording of the Settlement Act, does not need to abide by this definition. Over the past few decades, the United States has engaged in many heavily negotiated cases to help define this relationship. It has changed and developed over time to more accurately reflect a shared commitment to equality and historical justice. The government of Canada has as well. The state of Maine has refused to update or modernize their relationship accordingly. They are still operating from that same tired mindset of the 80s. But I'd like to bring some light and optimism to the discussion. The history of our relationship with the state of Maine is frustrating and draining. We have made some significant progress in recent years. Just this past legislative session, a bill to finally amend the Settlement Act in meaningful ways, LD 1626, made it through the House and passed preliminary voting in the Senate. It then stalled out once it hit Governor Mills's desk. She didn't outright veto it, but she might as well have. She had the opportunity to sign it, but chose not to. Governor Mills went against almost her entire party in this decision. The leaders of the Wabanaki nations had cooperated and negotiated for years leading up to that moment. The outcome was heartbreaking, but this fight will and must continue. But again, there is a positive outlook on all of this. The bill received overwhelming public support. I remember hearing that staffers in the State House requested that we stop telling our supporters to send in letters because they were overwhelmed. The last number I heard was over 2,000 letters of support from Mainers across the state. So when I say that the state has taken a stance, it is clear that it is not the entire state. Most of the people in Maine seem ready and willing to start working to mend this relationship. So now that I've probably exhausted you all with history, I'd like to turn our attention to the Settlement Act itself, what we can do today to work on this relationship together. To give some backstory of the Settlement Act, in the mid-1970s, the Passamaquoddy Nation began a suit against the state of Maine for claim over 2/3 of the modern-day landmass of the state. This claim was premised on the existence of the 1794 treaty, which had been held by the Passamaquoddy Nation in Medaknaguk. The treaty was between the Commonwealth of Massachusetts on behalf of the US federal government and the Passamaquoddy Indians and those of other tribes connected to them. This wording is why the Passamaquoddy were the lead in this suit, and also why the Penobscot and Wolastoqey nations were also included. The language other tribes connected to them is reference to the Wabanaki Confederacy. I originally wrote a whole section explaining the Wolastoqey involvement in the signing of this treaty. I ended up deleting it because I thought this presentation was already history heavy enough. In very brief terms, the 1794 treaty did not outline the entire Wabanaki claim to all of our territory. It did not outline the Passamaquoddy's claim or the Penobscots. The only land that it dealt with was the territory in which the United States at the time thought they had the authority to negotiate. This is important. At the time, the United States was still in a border dispute with Great Britain. They were intentionally aware that this section of the border was still unresolved between them. They limited negotiated treaty territory to a limited section of land, mostly in Passamaquoddy and Penobscot territory, to which they thought they could negotiate without starting a new war with Great Britain or the Wabanaki. The Treaty of 1794 does not outline the entire territory to which the Wabanaki nations maintain their sovereign claim to land and nationhood. For example, every Wolastoqey treaty that predates this one focuses on the protection of our ability to hunt and fish along the Wolastoq River and the Wolastoq River tributaries. In Maine, that is Aroostook County. This treaty makes no mention of the Wolastoq River. The claimed territory does not include it. This is not because we did not have claim to that land. It is because the United States negotiators did not believe they had the authority to sign a treaty in our territory. In fact, they believed that this is well documented in the minutes of the treaty conference, that were they to mention either the Wolastoqey or the Mi'kmaq by name in this treaty, it might renew conflict with Great Britain. This is an important part of the discussion. We still hear politicians in Maine claim that the state does not have a responsibility to recognize Wolastoqey territory in the state because we did not claim our land in Aroostook County in the Treaty of 1794. In fact, we did not sign any treaty with either the US or Great Britain for claim over our land. That is because we have never relinquished it, sold, or ceded it. Throughout the turn of the 19th century, this time period we are discussing, the land was unquestionably under our control and continued occupation, and it remains unceded to this day. Okay. Back to the Settlement Act. The Treaty of 1794 outlined Wabanaki claim to a massive amount of land in Maine. I think we should draw attention to the size of this claim. The U.S. did not do this out of the goodness of their hearts. They did this because it was the only way they could assure peace between themselves and a foreign nation. This land was firmly under the control of the Wabanaki. Before the United States could send settlers into any of the territory of these northern sections of Maine, they needed to sign an agreement with the actual landowners themselves. When I was younger, I was frustrated at the arguments of the Wabanaki legal team in 1980. Instead of mentioning any of this history, they instead make the argument that any purchases of Wabanaki Treaty territory by either the state or private interests after 1790 was in violation of federal law. In 1790, the United States passed a law called the Indian Trade and Non-Intercourse Act. In 1980, the Wabanaki legal team argued that the 1794 treaty between the Wabanaki and the federal government established a trust relationship on the federal level, and therefore any land purchases or land seizures by the Maine state governments or any private interests following 1794 was in violation of federal law. In short, this argument was cleverly composed. It placed the responsibility to assert our title claim onto the U.S. federal government and applied pressure on the state from a body to which they were obligated to listen. Over the course of 4 years, the Wabanaki nations and the state negotiated the Maine Indian Land Claim Settlement Act. The eventual act had both a federal and state component. The federal component is known as the Settlement Act. The state component is known as the Implementing Act. The main representation from the Wabanaki nations came from the Passamaquoddy and the Penobscot. At the time, the Houlton Band of Maliseets did not exist. Here in our territory, we were the Aroostook Association of Indians, which was an organization of Wolastoqey people living in places like Houlton, which did not have reservation land and did not have access to many resources. The Settlement Act created and federally recognized the Houlton Band of Maliseet Indians. As a small aside here, there were many Wolastoqey people living in Maine. There still are, but the United States and the state of Maine refused to recognize our existence until our inclusion in this act. The political and social environment leading up to the signing of the settlement was tenuous. The negotiations leading up to the moment had lasted for 4 years. 4 years of Mainers living in this area scared of the outcome, angry at the Wabanaki people for bringing this suit and making them scared for their land and livelihood. Maine newspapers and op-eds had stirred the population into a frenzy. Land sales in key places halted entirely. Big development projects like the Bangor Mall were put on hold because the cloudy title the land was on. Newspapers pinned these problems on the Wabanaki court case, and Mainers across the state were angry. The social environment was on the edge of violence. Violence did in fact break out in multiple places. There was a resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan in the state. Native people were scared and angry, and we were all ready for this all to be over. Compounding this was the issue of the U.S. presidency. These negotiations had occurred under the presidency of Jimmy Carter. Starting in 1980, however, Ronald Reagan was about to step into office. It was widely assumed, and probably accurately so, that Reagan would not have signed or even considered this agreement. If this issue was not settled before Reagan stepped into office, it was very possible that the past 4 years of expense and negotiation would have been for nothing. I explain this because all of these factors contributed to why both the state and the tribal negotiators rushed to settle out of court. In the years since, both sides have acknowledged that the act contained ambiguities, key issues that were left without full explanation and understanding. These ambiguities were acknowledged before the signing of the act, and it was agreed that there would be a body devoted to sorting out these issues. This was the impetus behind the creation of the Maine Indian Tribal State Commission, or MITSIC. MITSIC was created as a part of the Maine Implementing Act and was created to have equal representation from the state and from the tribal governments. There are 6 representatives of the state appointed by the governor and 6 representatives appointed by the tribal governments. It was assumed that this body would help navigate these still unresolved issues with equal representation from the state and the nations. Since its creation, MITSIC has continually suggested changes, approved by both the tribal commissioners and the state commissioners, for how we might create necessary changes in the act to better serve both the tribal nations and the state. The state has repeatedly refused to address the most significant of these concerns. This past effort in the State House, LD 1626, was further than we had ever gotten before. But this is the flaw in how this entire relationship operates. MITSIC was created to bring issues to the state, but that is it. the state is not required to abide by any of the concerns brought to them. In my opinion, this is one of the biggest issues left unresolved, and so much of the anger of the last 40 years hinges on this mistake. The compromise was to settle out of court with a document which in many ways was still unresolved, but to create a body which would continually work to resolve these issues with equal representation from both the state and the tribes. Yet Mitsik was not given any actual authority. In 1996, for example, Mitsik drafted a list of recommendations which include many of the same issues we're still facing today. In 1997, 25 years later, we're still requesting these same changes. Within these recommendations, Mitsik brought to the state's attention sources of conflict between the Wabanaki nations and the state. As one example, as federally recognized Indian tribes, the Passamaquoddy tribe, the Penobscot Nation, the Houlton Band of Maliseets, and the Mi'kmaq Nation should be eligible for all federal Indian benefits. Yet the wording of the settlement denies this access and states that any federal law enacted after October 10, 1980 for, quote, the benefit of Indians, which would affect or preempt the laws of the state of Maine, shall not apply within the state of Maine unless it is specifically made applicable within the state, end quote. This is known as the now infamous Section 1735B. This clause in the Settlement Act has made many federal Indian laws inapplicable in the state. Updates to the changing relationships between the federal government and Native nations, helpful legislation designed to combat systemic issues facing Native communities across the country are not accessible to Wabanaki nations because of the wording of this clause. Examples of this type of legislation are the Federal Tribal Law and Order Act of 2010 and the Violence Against Women Act, both of which would increase our jurisdictional power to manage our own court systems and try our own cases. The Stafford Act, which would allow us to declare our own states of emergency and gain access to federal funding. This would be particularly helpful in our efforts to combat the opioid pandemic, which is still ravaging our communities. The Federal Indian Gaming Regulatory Act, which will allow us access to federal Indian gaming policy and improve our economic situation as well as the economies of everyone around us. And also full access to the Indian Child Welfare Act, ICWA, which would allow us to protect our own children and allow us the opportunity to keep our children in our home communities should they enter the foster care system. I mentioned this already, but ICWA in particular is an issue of primary concern for the Houlton Band of Maliseets. Because of the specific wording in the Act, which treats the Houlton Band on a different level than the other Wabanaki nations, unlike the other nations, we do not have full access to ICWA. A key part of the reason why the Houlton Band was treated differently than the Passamaquoddy and the Penobscot is because of the history I mentioned earlier. Our territory was not included in the disputed territory of the 1794 treaty. Again, this is not because we do not have claim to our own land. Of course we do. It is because at the time, that territory was outside the jurisdiction of what the United States felt comfortable negotiating. That is because it is still our land and still sovereign and unceded. Our choice to not include our territory in colonial documents like the Treaty of 1794 should be an indication of the retention of sovereign control. A hyper-focus on colonially signed treaties as the only evidence of indigenous control over territory is Eurocentric, backwards, and frankly racist. This is a massive injustice that is simply premised on inaccurate history and is still taught today. I hope that is a key point all of you take away from this presentation. Wolastoqey people still live in Maine, and we still have rights and claim to our own land. From the start of the relationship after the settlement, the Clause 1735B was an issue of contention. The Wabanaki nations have repeatedly shared that this language did not appear in the settlement agreement till only after the tribes and the state approved the agreement. I was not alive at this time, but all of our elders present in this moment have repeated this again and again. The state has adamantly denied these accusations. To this day, I have seen lawmakers personally affronted at the very implication. I've watched as they entrench themselves deeper and deeper into these arguments in defense of the act. I was not alive in 1980. I view this as a historian might. I can tell you that regardless of either claim, this particular language was not a central part of the lengthy 4 years worth of negotiations between the tribes and the state, as a clause of this magnitude should necessarily have been. Regardless of whether or not this language appeared prior to the tribe's signing of the agreement, it certainly did not appear until the very last moment that it possibly could have. Mitsik highlighted this as an issue of concern 25 years ago. The tribal governments have been attempting to bring attention to it since the very beginning. Yet we still have not seen any meaningful change. The recommendations Mitsik have suggested have been largely ignored since the Commission's creation. Mitsik does not have any enforcement power. All they can do is recommend change. The state has no obligation to abide by those suggestions. The Wabanaki nations were led to believe that these ambiguities would be continually re-examined and updated. Just about every negotiator present at the signing of the act on both sides agrees today that the act was never intended to remain set in stone. It was intended to be continually readdressed and updated. But as the act is written, the decision to do anything regarding the settlement is entirely within the authority of the state. Despite the promises that the act would be continually updated, once the act was signed, forces within the state have taken the position that the issue is fully and finally closed. They say that a settlement is a settlement, and that is that. I've heard the phrase buyer's remorse from currently serving Maine legislators. The ambiguities left undecided in the act have been interpreted within the state court system only and largely decided in favor of increased jurisdictional authority for the state. I hope you see how frustrating and unfair this is, and the forces within the state which continue to use these same lines and refuse to do anything regarding the Settlement Act continue to perpetuate this inequity. I felt like it was necessary to begin my explanation of our current affairs with an examination of history first. The Settlement Act can loom so large over these discussions that it overshadows just about everything else. I wanted to bring our attention first to the original intention behind the Treaty of 1794 and the actual reason why the Settlement Act was created in the first place. I hope we can honestly question if the settlement actually embodies the original intention behind the treaty. That's why the historical perspective is a necessary place to start. The original intention of all of our treaties, not just the Treaty of 1794, was to create a relationship between sovereign nations and allies, a relationship necessarily built on peace and equality. I would argue that the eventual act intended to settle this document does not embody much of this at all. The Settlement Act worked to not just settle that singular land dispute, it went beyond settling land to settling jurisdiction. Again, the language they used was that they were attempting to not create a nation within a nation. This very language is not in line with the original relationship embodied by the treaties. In fact, it represents a fundamental misunderstanding of the treaties. Over the past 40 or so years, historical scholarship on the treaties has evolved in leaps and bounds. It has only been the past 2 or so generations that Native people across the country have had the opportunity to get advanced degrees in subjects like history and law, and finally share our side of the story. The history is necessarily changing. The negotiators in 1980 did not have access to this information. They could not conceptualize treaties outside the limited framework of colonialism. The Maine Settlement Act was one of the very first treaty settlement efforts of its kind in American history. As such, it looks fundamentally different than any later attempts. These later settlements settled land disputes with money and worked to create relationships between the tribal nations and the U.S. federal government. The Maine settlement, on the other hand, worked to place the tribes within the jurisdictional control of the state. Again, this was the first of its kind, and our case served as almost a guinea pig for later efforts across Indian country. I have never been to law school, but from what I've heard within classes on Indigenous law, the Maine Indian Land Claims Settlement Act is used as an example of what a tribal nation should never do. Perhaps the Settlement Act represents what could have been achieved in the social and political environment of the 80s, but we do not need to live with it today. We should be free to create a new future and a new relationship together, one that better represents the devotion to equality and justice that we value today. Over the past 5 years, representation from the state and tribal leadership have met in the State House and formed a task force devoted to amending the Act in meaningful ways. The result were the 22 task force recommendations and eventually LD 1626. In many ways, the 22 recommendations are a continuation of the same issues MIDSIC and the tribal governments have been bringing up since the very beginning. In very brief terms, the goal of these recommendations is to bring the state of Maine up to the standard of the rest of the country in federal Indian policy. It does not go as far as we would like, but that is the nature of any meaningful compromise. The path chosen in these recommendations was a path best suited to create the right kind of change for both sides and create a future for all of us. This coming legislative session, we will again be proposing these same changes. I hope you all go out and engage your friends and family on these conversations, and we can all work to create a more equitable future together. Thank you. Hope I've left time for questions. Yes.
So these are all we're discussing like large like state and federal legislations. What what are changes or actions that local communities could take in support of tribal sovereignty?
Absolutely, thank you. Well, so this current legislative session that we're in right now, we will be pursuing a very similar bill as LD 1626, which is these 22 task force recommendations. We're actually decided to split it into two bills, but we're working with on both sides of the aisle to find which of these recommendations will most likely have be able to get us to a 2/3 majority vote. In short, that means that we need to be engaging everyone on these issues. But that is what I would suggest. Talking to your friends and relatives and talking about these issues, and bringing it up with your representatives, that they will have the opportunity to vote yes or no on this session that we're currently in. And I encourage you all to reach out and ask them that they do. It's a long time coming, and we've been suggesting these changes for the past 40 years, and we've had a little bit momentum from last session, and a lot of optimism going into this one, a lot of support. So yeah, hopefully we'll finally get some of these big issues finally solved. Yeah. But the task force recommendations is not the only bill that will be before the legislature this session. We have a couple of them. Another one that I should have devoted some time to talk about, but I can talk about now, is changes to the Maine Constitution. So in 1867, the legislators in the state of Maine chose to remove from printed copies of the Maine Constitution Article 10, Section 5, which states that Maine would be obligated to accept the responsibilities from Massachusetts to uphold treaty obligations. Maine chose to remove that language from printed versions of the Constitution. It's still in effect, but it's just not included in the printed versions, which should never have happened. And that's another bill that we'll be pushing, advancing this coming session, is to re-include that language in the Constitution. So that's another one worth keeping an eye on. And there will be another one as well. So one of the big issues, so there was a bill for, many of you might be aware of the Advancing Equality for Wabanaki Nations Act. It was advanced by Jared Golden. And on the federal level, to address one of the biggest issues that came out of the task force recommendations, which was our inability to access federal Indian policy. In short, it would change that language to allow us access to federal Indian policy that's passed for the benefit of Native nations that are passed in the future going forward. That's what that bill attempted to do. Our senators adamantly stood against it. Angus King stood out among them and said this issue, again, came down to that jurisdiction between the U.S. federal government or the state government, and he argued that it should be argued only within the state, which in my opinion is very problematic, as the very basis of our relationship is nation to nation, as it should be, not nation to state. But in response to that kind of argument, that you should not have brought this to the federal government, we should be dealing with this in the state. This coming legislative session, we're going to be attempting to do exactly that. So we have another bill that will be very similar to the Advancing Equality for Wabanaki Nations Act, but here on the state level. It doesn't have a LD number yet, still a LR, which is legislative request number, but because we're still in the very early stages of this session. But that's another one to keep an eye out for. It would, yeah.
Are there any resources or organizations that you could point us to get more information to share with our friends and family?
Absolutely. The Wabanaki Alliance. The Alliance is a group of representatives from each of the different nations, the tribal governments. We have a board that is seated by ambassadors, the tribal representatives, and vice chiefs, and we have an advisory council that's seated by all the chiefs. And this is a way that we've been able to have representation from each of us, and provide a unified voice and advance these ideas together. And there's a website, the WabanakiAlliance.org, I believe. I don't want to get that incorrect, but just Google Wabanaki Alliance will get you there. And we have updates on the progress of our bills and news page and ways to contact us. Oh, hell yeah.
I was wondering if your presentation would be available. It was such a wonderful snapshot of the history that brought us to this place. And so many times when you try to talk about what's happening today in Maine, people are just so confused and really don't have much understanding of history, especially people in my age group.
Yeah.
Because you look back, you realize that we were taught a lot of history that was just from the colonial perspective.
It's one-sided, yeah. Thank you for that. And I would love to share a written copy, spread that around. Because I know I did dump a lot of information in here. This has been attempting to navigate these things has been something it's been a lifelong pursuit. I'm still young, but it's already.
How did you get interested in history?
I'm not sure I had much choice. I mean, it's when you're a native person, wondering how to navigate these things. I mean, yeah, I originally began wondering why my nation got split between that border, in Houlton, and all my relatives on the other side, and I spent a lot of time passing back and forth and wondering how the hell that happened. I went to UMaine in Orono, and my senior project I devoted to the Webster-Ashburn Treaty of 1842, and that's the treaty that officially solidified the location of the international border. And as a kid, I was convinced that was the problem. Like, they split our line, and so I went researched everything I could about that treaty, the treaty negotiations back and forth, and one of the things I almost really recognized was that my theory was that each the United States and Great Britain had signed treaties with us and claimed our land on the basis of these treaties. I was like, all right, I'm going to find this in these conference minutes somewhere, and I'm going to find references to our treaties and our nations. Not once in any of those conversations did Wabanaki land, our nations, ever be mentioned at all. That treaty is actually written as if the land in question is empty, save for the sparse European settlements. And actually, I wrote a paper on that. And essentially, what I said was that the line didn't impact us much at all. That despite the fact that that line split us right in half, our people never stopped using all of our land, and we weren't stopped going back and forth. My great uncle, actually, his name's Pat Muse. He was a basket maker. He lived in Mars Hill, and he sold baskets all through New Brunswick and passed back and forth all the time. And I don't think he ever considered that international travel. That's just our territory. And it was one of those things that happened over decades, century, where slowly our ability to just move through our land was eroded. And I shared that paper with Professor Andrew Bear Nicholas. She's a family friend. I met her in family in Tobic. And the first thing that she said when she looked at that, she was like, "Man, you got to get out of the U.S." And so she encouraged me to pursue graduate school up in New Brunswick. So that's what eventually brought me there. And yeah, so in short, I realized that if I was going to find these answers, I didn't have it in 1842. I had to go back further. And at some point, Native voices were just ignored. And despite the fact that we're here, we always have been. Yeah.
To me, you explained the different ways of seeing and understanding what sovereignty and what a treaty and what those mean in such different ways. And I just read Lisa Brooks, and she tries to do that too.
Yeah.
Very effectively.
Yeah.
But your explanation is wonderful.
Thanks.
Because I think that's a thing that so many non-native people just don't get.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's one of the big questions and why they're all scratching their head. And
Yeah. Thank you for
I
that.
encourage you
I'll
to
try
get
to.
this out there, because I think it would help
Yeah.
many, many people in the state to have a better understanding.
I think my.
Because a lot of us have heard of all these treaties, but how they're put together and
Yeah.
how they're intermeshed and what they really meant for tribal people. Yeah, we don't get it.
Yeah. Thanks. I think the benefit I have is that I have elders that are leading the way. I mentioned Professor Andrea Bear-Nicholas from St. Thomas University, but I feel like a lot of what I have to share here is I'm just kind of bridging that gap, bringing information that has existed within our communities for a long time, and I'm just attempting to bring it to everyone else here. Just be that bridge.
Zeke, your language is very, very plain and straightforward, and it's not all convoluted, and it's very easy to understand. And
Thank you.
Just your manner of delivery, I found it very easy to follow and visualize.
Cool.
So
Thank you.
I agree with Deirdre. That I have a whole other layer now of understanding. So
I'm glad.
Curious if you could reflect on the land back movement and sort of looking at this social historical framework and so on, and sort of reconciling, I think, philosophically with adopting a colonial construct, and where does that fit into this process?
Yeah, give me the hard question. Eh? I originally had.
I struggle with it all the time, so.
Yeah, I originally had I originally talked about land back in this presentation. I took it out actually. So, man, that's the difficult question, because the way Native people can relate to land is limited to what system we're in, which is very frustrating, particularly as I've seen the way Canada has adopted things. So when they were talking about Aboriginal title in Canada, it is sharing land. It's sharing resources, which is not really something we can do down in the States. It's not really. It's either yours or mine. There is no middle ground there. So in a lot of ways, Native nations down here in the U.S., we are forced to kind of abide by that model and advocate for the simple title property ownership, as opposed to common grounds. Which for in Canada, the land back movement does look a little bit different. It is that let's share land, let's return crown land, which is these common grounds, to native control, and it's pretty straightforward in that way. Down here in the States, it's very much limited to what the United States can even conceptualize when it comes to property. Hopefully that was helpful. Probably not.
I mean, I guess, do you see a way forward? Do you see it working in some way that fee title ownership and acquiring more lands will ultimately benefit your community?
Yes. I mean, we work within the system we have and the opportunities that we have. So if that means establishing title over our land as in a way that the American court system can understand, then so be it. And that is something that we should be advocating for and trying to do. I think a good example of that would be the Passamaquoddy Nation, rebuying or buying land that was always theirs, but having to purchase, for millions of dollars. And as historically unfair as that is, in a lot of ways, that is what we're forced to do at this point. So, but yeah, it's a difficult question. There's a reason why I took it out, because it's difficult to navigate. Hopefully it was helpful. Okay.
Jen, do we have any questions in chat?
Yeah, no, I checked just to,
There's something there.
Just in case.
yeah.
Oh, okay. Cool. Well,
Yeah, I think, thank you for coming.
yeah, thank you, everyone.
for-